The young and the restless spoilers. The rumor mill swirling through Genoa City proved once again that nothing stays buried for long, especially when power, legacy, and old grudges collide in a perfect storm. The whispers that began in quiet corners of Jabot's executive floors had grown into a roar. Jack Abbott was far closer to losing the family company than even his fiercest critics had anticipated. The threat was not a hostile takeover, not a boardroom betrayal, not even the usual Newman interference. It was something far more sophisticated, far more insidious, and far more modern than any threat Jabot had ever encountered, a full-scale artificial intelligence attack designed to infiltrate the company's network, destabilize its financial core, and leave it vulnerable to collapse in the blink of an eye. Jack had believed that his tech team, experienced, loyal, and trained for crisis, was prepared for anything. But the truth was more brutal. No firewall was strong enough, no system was secure enough to withstand the weapon Cain Ashby had helped bring into existence, a digital monstrosity engineered to silently disassemble centuries-old empires from the inside out, just as easily as a hand crushing glass. And the irony was cruel. Cain had never intended for Jabot to be the primary target. His ambitions were far grander, far more reckless, centered on creating a tool capable of overpowering the oldest financial dynasties in Wisconsin. To Cain, Arabesque was not merely a business, it was a throne built on shadows, algorithms, and illusions of untouchability. And yet, for all the sophistication of his AI, for all the secrecy with which he operated, Cain made the fatal mistake that all overreaching men eventually make: he invited the wrong person into his circle. In his desperation to scale Arabesque faster, to solidify his legacy before the ghosts of his past could catch up to him, he hired Phyllis Summers without fully understanding her motives, her desperation, or her long-standing ability to turn every situation, including her own failures, into opportunities. Phyllis did what she always did when cornered: she struck first. She infiltrated Cain's system, outsmarted his overconfident programmers, and stole the AI weapon he believed was unbreakable. But instead of using it for herself, she made a move that sent shockwaves through Genoa City. She handed the AI tool directly to Victor Newman. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even loyalty. It was strategy. Phyllis knew that if Cain ever discovered her involvement, she needed someone untouchable standing between her and retribution. Victor was not just protection, he was a nuclear shield. And Victor, in turn, did something no one expected, not even Phyllis. Rather than attack Jabot and reignite his decades-long war with Jack, he used Cain's own AI weapon to obliterate the empire Cain had built on deceit, inheritance manipulation, and technological dominance. Overnight, Arabesque crumbled. Systems failed. Accounts destabilized. The company that Cain believed could challenge even Newman Enterprises was reduced to digital rubble, shattered by the very man Cain had hoped to surpass. But the destruction of Arabesque was not just a calculated business move. It was personal, deeply, unquestionably personal. For Victor, Cain represented another arrogant opportunist trying to manipulate the power landscape of Genoa City without understanding the rules of the game. For Victor, Cain was a threat to the order he had spent a lifetime constructing. And Victor never tolerated disorder. Meanwhile, Cain's world continued to collapse piece by piece, and the truth behind his sudden rise to wealth and power began to unravel with it. Colin Atkinson, the father Cain had spent most of his life trying to distance himself from, emerged from the shadows of memory with a truth so shocking, so meticulously hidden, that even Cain struggled to absorb it. Colin and Victor were not opposites, not by a long shot. They were reflections of the same ruthless philosophy. Do whatever it takes to ensure the survival and elevation of the family line, no matter how immoral the path might be. Colin had once fallen in love with a wealthy older woman whose fortune included properties, estates, and what viewers would later recognize as a labyrinthine chateau in the south of France. A place that appeared extravagant on the outside but hid secrets even darker underneath. The inheritance Colin secured was staggering, an empire in its own right, but he never used it for himself. Instead, he orchestrated everything so that Kane would one day inherit the entire fortune, believing that this wealth would secure Kane's future in a way Colin himself never could. When Colin died, Kane stepped into the legacy without fully understanding its origins or the moral rot that accompanied it. With the inheritance in hand, Kane built Arabesque from the ground up, convinced he was forging a new identity independent of the chaos he had grown up in. But wealth built on manipulation rarely creates freedom, it only builds a larger cage. In Kane's case, it blinded him to the flaws in his own decisions, including allowing his tech team to operate without accountability. They engineered the AI weapon that became the centerpiece of Arabesque's power. A program capable of silently breaching the digital defenses of any major corporation, destabilizing its financial frameworks, and creating vulnerabilities that would allow Kane to quietly assume control. What Kane never anticipated was that the tool would become the very thing that destroyed him. Victor had turned it against him with surgical precision, leaving Kane furious, humiliated, and cornered. But Kane's anger was nothing compared to the storm brewing silently around Jack Abbott. The destruction of Arabesque only heightened the danger surrounding Jabot because the stolen AI was still active, still evolving, and still capable of dismantling a company from the inside out. The threat had not disappeared, it had simply changed hands. And with Victor in control, Jack found himself facing an enemy with limitless resources, a personal vendetta decades old, and a brand new weapon more powerful than anything Genoa City had ever seen. The fall of Arabesque became the first tremor in a much larger earthquake, one that threatened to expose every hidden weakness in both the Abbott and Newman empires. In the end, Kane's fatal mistake was not the creation of the AI. It was believing that he could control the outcome. Victor's greatest miscalculation lay in assuming Jabot would fall in silence. And Jack's growing fear, one he had not yet spoken aloud, was that the war he thought was long behind him had only been sleeping, waiting for new weapons and new wounds to bring it roaring back to life. And with Kane's downfall lighting the path, the next blow would come faster, harder, and far more devastating than anyone in Genoa City was prepared to face. Kane Ashby's unannounced arrival at the Abbott mansion was not just a desperate attempt to repair the damage caused by his own unraveling empire. It was a warning, one Jack Abbott never expected to hear directly from a man whose ambitions had contributed to the chaos now looming over Genoa City. When Kane stepped across the polished marble floor of the Abbott estate, the tension in his shoulders made it clear he was not there to negotiate, manipulate, or seek sympathy. He came with the kind of truth that could topple dynasties, and the air in the foyer grew heavier with every word he uttered. He confessed that the AI weapon, his prized digital creation, his ultimate leverage in the corporate battlefield, had been stolen. Worse, it had fallen into the hands of Victor Newman. The revelation hit Jack with the force of a memory he had spent years suppressing. Decades earlier, Victor had nearly destroyed Jabot, ripping the company from John Abbott's hands in a power move that was as ruthless as it was traumatic. Jack had spent years rebuilding the Abbott legacy, piece by piece, refusing to allow his father's humiliation to define the future. But hearing Kane say the words aloud, that Victor now possessed a weapon capable of erasing Jabot with a keystroke, felt like history clawing its way out of the grave. Jack could almost hear his father's voice, could almost see the fury in John's eyes the day Victor pillaged his life's work. And now, once again, the Abbott family found itself standing at the edge of a precipice carved by Newman ambition. The digital threat was unlike anything Jack had ever faced. No lawsuit, no hostile takeover, no corporate sabotage from the past compared to this. Victor's new AI weapon was invisible, silent, capable of infiltrating systems without leaving fingerprints. Jack realized that if Victor chose to unleash it on Jabot, the destruction would be instant and total. Every division, every financial model, every department the Abbotts had fought to stabilize would collapse before they even understood what had hit them. Diane, standing beside Jack, felt her own wave of dread. As someone who had spent years fighting for redemption, for acceptance, and for a future with Jack and Kyle, she knew the devastation that would follow if Jabot fell. For Diane, Jabot was more than a company. It was proof that she had returned from the ashes of her past and rebuilt a life worth protecting. Kyle, listening to Kane's confession, understood the magnitude of the crisis in a more practical sense. He had grown up hearing stories about Victor's wrath, about the wars between Newman Enterprises and Jabot, about the moments that defined Genoa City's corporate battlefield long before he stepped into adulthood. But this was not just another chapter in that rivalry, this was an existential threat. Victor had always been a titan, but now he possessed something beyond traditional power. A weapon born from code, ambition, and Kane's hubris. Meanwhile, Kane's expression carried both guilt and fear. He knew that, despite his own mistakes, he had not intended to drag the Abbotts into this ruin. Yet Phyllis Summers' involvement complicated everything. Her theft of the AI tool, her misguided attempt to position herself as a hero, or perhaps a queenmaker, had sent the entire landscape careening out of control. Kane admitted openly that Phyllis might have been the one to steal the technology before delivering it into Victor's hands. And although Kane spoke the truth, even he struggled to make sense of her motivations. Phyllis had never been predictable. Loyalty was not her currency, survival was. Phyllis herself was blindsided when news broke that Arabesque, the company Kane built, had been decimated by the very weapon she thought she could manipulate. She had not intended for Kane to fall, nor Jack, nor anyone else. Her sole target, in her mind, had always been Victor Newman. She wanted leverage, wanted protection, wanted a future where she could reclaim power in a city that had never truly forgiven her. But Victor, as always, played a deeper game. He used the tool not to help Phyllis but to crush Kane, proving he was still the one man in Genoa City who could flip a corporation to its knees in a matter of hours. What Phyllis had not expected was the ripple effect, the collateral damage. The destruction of Kane's empire only made Victor's grasp tighter, his arsenal more dangerous. And Phyllis suddenly realized she was a loose thread in a tapestry of consequences she had never intended to weave. She learned that Victor had promised her something extraordinary in exchange for her cooperation, leadership over Jabot. A seat of unimaginable influence. A chance to stand at the apex of Genoa City with the Abbott legacy in her hands. The promise itself was seductive, intoxicating, and almost certainly a lie. Phyllis knew Victor's history, she knew he rarely gave something without taking something far more valuable in return. And yet the glimmer of power was enough to make her gamble everything. Her fear now came not from Victor, but from imagining how Jack, and the entire Abbott family, would react if they discovered she had been promised the keys to Jabot. The outrage, the vengeance, the fracture it would create could be catastrophic. And still, the biggest storm had not yet arrived. Victor and Adam Newman continued to publicly deny the existence of the AI weapon, insisting the rumors were nothing more than exaggerations and paranoia. But their silence, their strategic refusal to engage, told Jack everything he needed to know. Victor wasn't denying because the story was false, he was denying because the truth was too powerful, too dangerous, too damning to acknowledge. And Adam, standing at his father's side, became a symbol of the enforcement Victor now wielded. A son with a complicated moral compass, a man torn between guilt and ambition, and the perfect protector of a secret capable of rewriting the corporate landscape forever. As Jack, Diane, and Kyle regrouped within the mansion, the sense of dread grew thicker. They were no longer facing a traditional adversary. They were facing a threat without form, without conscience, without a clear method of defeat. AI was not a person they could confront, nor a plan they could sabotage. It was a monster forged from lines of code, strengthened by Victor's resources, and unleashed with no regard for the families it would destroy. And Kane's warning made one thing painfully clear: the Abbotts were running out of time. Whether Phyllis intended it or not, her involvement had set the stage for a confrontation the likes of which Genoa City had never seen. Whether Victor intended it or not, his acquisition of the AI weapon had reignited a war decades old. And whether Jack intended it or not, he was now standing in the same position his father once endured, on the edge of losing everything he had ever fought for. The only question left was whether the Abbott legacy would survive a second strike from Victor Newman, or whether this time, the fall would be permanent.